At the beginning of 1946, while most of Europe was attempting often shakily to stitch together the tatters of bomb-blasted cities' splintered families and fractured identities, a very different kind of reconstruction was taking place in the rubble-dusted port of Dosk. The high-ceilinged courtroom in the former Reich Postal Building had been hastily converted into a tribunal chamber. Its cracked marble floors were scrubbed, its Nazi eagles pried from the walls, its wooden benches polished as if cleansing the furniture might also cleanse the past. Yet nothing could scrub away the memories of Stutthof. Over the course of several freezing January mornings, a procession of young women, many no older than 25, filed in under the stern gaze of Soviet and Polish guards. They were not architects of genocide, not policymakers, not the iron-fisted commanders whose names would headline the Nuremberg proceedings farther west. They were secretaries who once sharpened pencils in rural village schools, waitresses who had balanced trays in smoky beer halls, farmers' daughters who had milked cows before dawn. They were, by every conventional measure, ordinary. And yet these ostensibly unremarkable women had worn the gray-green uniform of the SS Frauenschaft. They had carried pistols on their hips and whips in their gloved hands. They had patrolled the barbed wire perimeters of Stutthof with a diligence that suggested not reluctance, but pride. To understand the magnitude of their crimes, one must step back, beyond the quiet hush of the courtroom, beyond the brittle winter light slanting through cracked windows, and revisit the feverish machinery of Stutthof itself. Established in September 1939 as a holding pen for Polish intelligentsia, the camp metastasized over 6 relentless years into a sprawling extermination complex framed by pine forests and the gray waters of the Baltic. By war's end, it comprised more than 40 satellite subcamps, an overworked crematorium, a gas chamber disguised as a bathhouse, and a conveyor belt of suffering, so consistent it could be measured like factory output. 110,000 prisoners entered, roughly 65,000 never emerged. These statistics, horrifying in their own right, do not convey the granular cruelty of daily life, the morning roll calls that stretched for hours in sleet, so cold it flayed skin from bone. The forced labor details that hauled granite blocks until shoulder joints tore free. The macabre sports sessions in which guards ordered emaciated prisoners to run hurdles until hearts stuttered to a stop. Such brutality did not operate in a vacuum. It required participants who would not merely obey, but innovate, who would take abstract orders and translate them into the intimate language of violence. Into that void stepped women like Gerda Steinhoff, whose blonde braids once fluttered behind the wooden driver's cabin of a Gdańsk tram, and Jenny Wanda Barkman, whose porcelain skin and arched eyebrows earned her the prisoner's grim nickname, the Beautiful Beast. These guards were not anomalies. They were components of a larger, socio-political alchemy that transmuted clerks into killers. Recruited through newspaper ads promising good pay, warm barracks, and patriotic duty, the women arrived at Stuttof's training school on a windswept hillock just outside the main camp fence. Their seasoned SS instructors drilled them in the choreography of domination, the precise angle of a rifle but strike to the kidney, the cadence of commands barked in perfect timing with boot heels, the rapid identification of Arbeitsfig fit for labor versus Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, a euphemism for death. Within a matter of weeks, sometimes days, the new recruits graduated to full postings inside the women's compound, the crematorium yard, or the infamous selection ramps where deportation trains sighed to a halt. The speed of that metamorphosis is crucial. It demonstrates that the slide from civilian monotony to homicidal zeal required no tragic backstory, no pre-existing pathology, only opportunity, indoctrination, and a social architecture that rewarded the subjugation of the other. While Stutthof never attained the ghastly celebrity of Auschwitz or Majdanek, the cruelty engineered within its wired confines was no less systematic. Its commandant, Paul Werner Hopp, favored a managerial style that treated corpses like ledger entries, inputs, outputs, losses, efficiencies. The female guards absorbed that ethos. They were expected to keep count of prisoners down to the single digit, to log confiscated jewelry in black ink columns, to record the caloric value of a ladle of rutabaga soup. Yet paperwork alone could not enforce terror. So each statistic, each inventory line, acquired flesh in the shrieks of the flogged, the fever of typhus, the silent descent of Cyclone B pellets cascading through a vent. It was here that Steinhoff proved invaluable. She possessed a gift for administration wedded to a merciless eye for weakness. Survivors recalled her strolling the selection lines with a clipboard, tapping a fountain pen against her chin before flicking it toward the frail, the pregnant, the elderly. Those subtle gestures sealed fates with the efficiency of a stamped decree. Barkman, by contrast, embodied theatrical sadism. She roamed the roll call squares in high-heeled jack boots, her tailored uniform cinched tight, her lashes darkened with stolen prisoner eyeliner. If an inmate collapsed, she delivered a single shot from her service pistol, a bullet she would later list in her ammunition ledger with meticulous neatness. When the Eastern Front thundered ever closer, Soviet artillery throbbing like a heartbeat beneath the Baltic wines, Stuthev's leadership initiated evacuation. The euphemism cloaked what would become some of the war's most lethal death marches. Between January and April 1945, nearly 50,000 prisoners were herded into columns snaking through snow-blanketed forests toward the German interior. Food rations consisted of frozen beets scraped from railway embankments. Shelter meant huddling beneath overturned carts while guards warmed their hands over barrel fires. Female SS personnel marched alongside, rifles slung casually over shoulders, selecting stragglers for execution with a lethargic wave as though pruning wilted branches. Witnesses later testified that Barkman shot a 14-year-old girl for lagging, then confiscated the child's threadbare scarf to protect her own neck from the cold. Others recalled Steinhoff methodically checking prisoner numbers against transport lists even as artillery flashes stained the horizon red, ensuring that no assets slipped away into the night. In the calculus of the collapsing Reich, and dead labor was still labor. A corpse that perished outside official oversight was an accounting error. Liberation, when it finally came, arrived not as cinematic triumph, but as an exhausted exhalation. On May 9, 1945, Soviet troops entered the skeletal remains of Stutthof. They found barracks littered with lice-ridden blankets, warehouses stacked with shoes, eyeglasses, human hair. In the crematorium yard, heaps of ash still smoldered beneath a crust of snowmelt. Amid this desolation staggered 100 survivors, walking skeletons, whose first requests were for bread and silence. They spoke little at first, yet their eyes told stories that seeped through interpreter notebooks and onto the pages of newly formed investigative dossiers. Names surfaced, repeated with uncanny consistency: Steinhoff, Barkman, Elizabeth Becker, the shy clerk who escorted gas chamber groups with the detachment of a train conductor punching tickets. Alfreda Monka, the diminutive escort guard, whose soft voice never rose above a murmur even as she slammed rifle butts into prisoners' ribs. Each testimony added a stroke to an increasingly vivid portrait of female complicity. Polish authorities, rebuilding a justice system from courthouse rubble, formed a special commission under Judge Jan Sen. The Soviets supplied photographic film, stenographers, and a trove of captured SS files. Survivors were ferried to Gdansk by army trucks wrapped in donated Red Cross coats. There, they sat across from their former tormentors in a room that still smelled faintly of smoke and disinfectant. It was a tableau both surreal and visceral, faces that had loomed over them in nightmares now demoted to defendants, their uniforms replaced by ill-fitting civilian dresses, their hair shorn of vanity. Some wept, some stared icy daggers. Some, like Barkman, allowed a cryptic half-smile to play at the corners of rouged lips as if the trial itself were but another macabre stage on which to perform. The prosecutions relied not solely on eyewitness testimony, but on the regimented bureaucracy the Nazis had left behind. Ledger books bore Steinhoff's looping signature, beside annotation Sonderbehandlung Durchführt, special treatment executed. Transport lists matched survivor recollections down to the minute a train hissed into Stuthhof siding. A blood-spattered whip, its handle engraved with initials JWB, was retrieved from the deserted guard barracks. Forensic analysts traced the tooling to a leather shop in Berlin that specialized in SS orders. Confronted with such evidence, the women offered a spectrum of defenses. Some invoked obedience, they were cogs in a male-dominated machine. Others professed ignorance, they had supervised laundry rooms, not crematoria. Barkman, ever theatrical, declared she was merely maintaining order during chaos. Yet under cross-examination, cracks emerged: contradictory statements about shift schedules, forged sick notes, curious absences during key atrocities. Gerda Steinhoff was one such woman. At only 23, she rose quickly from tram conductor to feared camp guard. She gave orders, participated in selections, and was often seen overseeing some of the most brutal aspects of camp life. Her presence alone struck fear into prisoners. When captured in 1945, she maintained composure during her trial, but claimed to have only followed orders. Survivors remembered her vividly pointing during selections, beating prisoners, and orchestrating transfers to the gas chambers. The court ultimately sentenced her to death. She climbed the scaffold in Gdańsk without a word, just as stoic as she had been in Stutthof. Her execution, along with others, symbolized a reckoning with those who had personified Nazi cruelty. Not all female guards were as outwardly brutal as Steinhoff. Alfreda Manka, only 22 when she joined, maintained a quiet demeanor. Yet, she was present during selections and marches, carried out orders without hesitation, and enforced discipline with cold efficiency. At her trial, she claimed ignorance, but the survivors knew better. Though not sentenced to death, she received 10 years in prison. She lived out her life in obscurity, her silence never cleansing her role in a system built on obedience and death. Then there was Ua Paradis, calculated, firm, and deeply involved in surveillance and selections. She escorted groups to their deaths with quiet precision, enforced rules, and punished deviations without emotion. Her trial was damning, and she too was hanged in Gdańsk. Among the most chilling aspects of these stories is how ordinary their backgrounds were. Waitresses, clerks, farmers transformed into figures of fear. Elizabeth Becker, the youngest among them at 21, represented the terrifying banality of evil. Calm and soft-spoken, she walked inmates to the gas chambers without shouting, never breaking protocol. She showed some remorse at her trial, but it was too little, too late. Her presence during selections, her silence, and her unwavering commitment to her duties sealed her fate. Public executions in April 1946 brought these narratives to a visceral conclusion. Thousands gathered to watch as young women, once empowered by uniforms, faced the gallows. It wasn't vengeance, it was a societal attempt at closure. The silence of the crowd spoke louder than condemnation. Each drop of the trapdoor was a declaration. Those who participated, no matter how small their role, would not escape accountability. These executions were not hidden. They were public, deliberate, and symbolic. The camp guards didn't scream, beg, or ask forgiveness. They simply waited, as they had made others wait. Then came the silence, a silence that echoed the finality of their crimes. To grasp why their individual stories resonated so powerfully, one must step back to the wider mechanism that produced them. By late 1942, the SS had realized that the rapid expansion of the camp network required ever more personnel than the male ranks alone could provide. Women were recruited under glossy promises of good pay, warm barracks, and a chance to serve the fatherland without facing the chaos of the front. Most arrived thinking they would perform routine clerical duties. In reality, they stood at the edge of industrialized murder. Inside the camp, the geography of authority was mapped in boots and whistles. The women's section lay beyond a narrow gate where the dirt turned to mud after every rainfall and the stench of the crematorium floated on the Baltic wind. Guards paced catwalks above electrified fences while inmates in striped rags shuffled from barrack to workshop to quarry. At dawn, a whistle shrieked. Gerda Steinhoff emerged, her cap cocked at an angle she believed conveyed authority. She inspected the line of prisoners, eyes sliding over gaunt faces like merchandise. Farther down the row stood Alfreda Manka, clutching a clipboard, noting labor assignments. Manka's cruelty was measured, almost bureaucratic. She did not relish flogging, yet she never interfered when it happened. She believed rules were iron rails upon which the train of the Reich must run, and if a body fell onto the tracks, it was the body's fault for being there. In later testimony, an inmate recalled slipping on ice while carrying a vat of thin soup. Manka recorded the spillage as sabotage, and the entire block was deprived of their rations. Ua Paradis patrolled the perimeter paths, her boots smart, her uniform immaculate. She carried a shepherd dog named Lux on a short leash. Lux needed few commands, he sensed terror like smoke. Paradis would pause beside an exhausted prisoner, give a tiny whistle that no other guard seemed to hear, and Lux surged forward. Teeth met flesh, screams rent the cold air, and Paradis logged the assault as an attempted escape. She drafted reports in precise script, each sentence a facade of professional detachment suggesting order where only blood and fear reigned. The youngest, Elizabeth Becker, arrived in late 1944 when the Red Army thundered closer to East Prussia. She had worked at a confectionery before the war and could decorate marzipan roses so delicate they melted at a breath. She still carried the scent of vanilla on her skin during the first weeks. Prisoners later said a scent that mocked the foul brew of camp life. Becker's cruelty was not inventive, it was mundane. She marched inmates to barracks, barred latrines after curfew, turned back any who lingered at sick bay. She washed her hands in an enamel basin purchased from company stores thoroughly, methodically as if in washing, the filth was only on the others. Stutthof collapsed like a rotten lung when Soviet artillery boomed across the Vistula Delta. Guards fled, prisoners scattered into snowy forests. Yet many female overseers were captured within weeks, betrayed by their vanity. They still wore boots polished with lard, caps bearing the silver Death's Head badge. Polish partisans recognized them instantly. Steinhoff was found hiding in a farmhouse loft, Monka in a freight wagon, Becker on a country road trying to pass as a refugee. A parody surrendered when her dog was killed by shellfire. The Gdańsk tribunal convened beneath broken chandeliers in what had once been a guild hall. Judges wore black robes stitched from salvaged cloth, a reminder that even justice had been bombed into rags. Yet the courtroom crackled with purpose. Witnesses filed in, emaciated survivors whose striped uniforms hung like ghosts, villagers forced to bury the dead, railway clerks who logged transports. Every testimony chipped away at the defense of just following orders. Prosecutors displayed sticks splintered with dried blood, registers of punitive beatings, and torn postcards from families who never received answers. During recesses, crowds gathered outside, hungry for glimpses of the accused. Some shouted curses, others simply stared, trying to reconcile the ordinariness of these women with the enormity of what had been done. A vendor sold hot potatoes to spectators. Steam blurred the winter air like breath over the stories being told within. Journalists scribbled dispatches by candlelight describing how Steinhoff's gloved hands rested calmly on the dock rail, how Becker burst into tears when shown a child's all recovered from a mass grave, how Monka's voice had dried into a flat whisper when the clerk read out the names of those who died. Sentence day arrived with wet snow that plastered roofs and muffled footsteps. The judges read verdicts in sonorous polish that echoed off stone pillars. Death for Steinhoff, death for Paradis, death for Becker. 10 years for Monka. The room did not erupt in jubilation. Instead, a hush fell, the hush that precedes a storm or a burial. Outside, the crowd shifted, murmured, turned toward the makeshift gallows erected in the prison yard. Execution was set for dawn 3 weeks later, swift but not secret. In that interim, the condemned lived in cells whose barred windows faced the sea. Guards, now Polish, delivered thin soup and black bread. Steinhoff asked for paper and ink to write a final letter. The letter survives, filed in dusty archives. It contains 4 sentences addressed to her parents. She expressed regret that she had failed them, not regret for those whom she had beaten. Becker prayed aloud each night, words tumbling over each other in frantic whispers. Monka, spared the noose, paced her cell, tracing patterns on the cold floor with her bare toes, feeling each crack as a minute scraped from her life. The executions took place on April 26, 1946. A platform was mounted against the prison wall, ropes dangling like question marks. Thousands gathered, packed shoulder to shoulder, silent. The condemned wore gray dresses, no insignia, no rank stripped of the symbols that had once loaned them power. Steinhoff climbed first. She did not look at the crowd. The hangman adjusted the knot. A priest murmured scripture. There was a snap, a collective intake of breath, and then only the sound of flat sea air battering against the harbor. Becker followed, Paradis last. Lux cried out from Paradis' old cell, a haunting howl that echoed above the silence, an animal lament that carried beyond the yard like a requiem. Monka watched from a cell window. She later wrote that the silence frightened her more than any shout could. In that silence, she felt judgment rolling across generations. Released in 1953, she drifted through East German factories under an assumed name, married a machinist, and died in 1998. No children, no gravestone, only a yellowing employment record that listed her as an unskilled laborer. The contrast between her past and her anonymity was itself a verdict. Why revisit these lives? Because they force us to confront how tyranny recruits the ordinary. None of these women were monsters in childhood. They laughed at village fairs, kissed sweethearts behind haystacks, wrote diary entries about cinema matinees. They were ordinary until uniforms, ideology, and opportunity twisted them. Their stories caution that evil rarely announces itself with red eyes and claws. It often arrives in neat handwriting, in the smooth click of polished boots, in quiet young women who simply obeyed a code. Theirs is not just a history, it is a warning.